Greetings my friends and welcome to this week's tactics video. It's Astorath versus Lemartes in terms of who is going to be best to lead your death company across the battlefield in the 10th edition with a new Blood Angels Codex. Astorath's been given some buffs. Lemartes remains strong. He was strong for like the entire first year of 10th edition. So let's get in, let's talk Blood Angels, and hopefully by the end of the video you will know who you want to lead your death company in your next game of Warhammer 40,000. Hello, my name is John, I'm the Blood Angels Commander, and every week I'm going to tell you how to get the most out of your Blood Angels on the tabletop in Warhammer 40,000. So, which of the named chaplains is best to lead the 10-man death company with jump packs, right? So we're going to dive into everything here. So firstly, we need to know how we can arm 10 death company Marines. So bottom line is, they have changed. So we're going to get 2 special pistols, 2 plasma pistols, we're going to get 3 power fists and 2 eviscerators. The default weapons that we have to hang on to are the 6 heavy bolt pistols and the 4 chain swords. So if I was going to arm my guys, I would do something like this. 2 guys with plasma pistols with chain swords. The reason is if they overcharge their plasmas, you have to kill that model, so you only lose a chain sword. 3 guys with the standard heavy bolt pistol and chainsword, 2 guys with an infernal pistol and power fist. I mean, I guess they are they're like an expensive guy, right? Like if he dies, it's quite a lot to lose, so you would remove those models last. We've got 1 model with a heavy bolt pistol and a power fist, and we've got 2 models with essentially heavy bolt pistols and eviscerators, even though they're not really holding the heavy bolt pistols. That's what they've got. As models die, typically you want to initially kill the models with just chain swords, right? You want to keep those power fists and those eviscerators alive to the end. If you don't ever want to overcharge your plasma pistols, you could probably put the plasma pistols on your eviscerator models or these other power fist models. But you want to keep your power fist and eviscerator models alive. And there is a little bit of an exception to that, which we'll come back to later. But for the most part, when models die, remove the heavy bolt pistol and chainsword models first, because they are the ones that are like the weakest or the lowest value within the unit. So let's talk about Astorath, right? So he returns with a much improved weapon profile. He is now 7 attacks on the charge at strength 9 in Liberator Assault Group. He does have that AP3, he does have Dev Wounds and Precision. He does Dev Wounds every single time you make a charge move. So models with melee weapons will make devastating wounds, and there is a fallback and charge stratagem now, so you want to be using that as often as you can to give them Dev Wounds. And this is the only way in 2 of her detachments, the Liberator Assault Group and the Angelic Host, in which any models can have fight on death. So as the Death Company die, you're gonna roll 5 saves for the Death Company. You fail all the saves. Let's say you fail all the Feel No Pain, so you've got 5 dead models. You have to choose the models 1 at a time, and you have to roll the 4 up. And this could be the situation where you want to choose a different model. So you could choose one of your chainsword models, you roll a 4 up, he fights on death. Or you could choose one of your power fist models, you roll a 4 up, he fights on death. It's pretty risky to use this to pick your special weapons, you know, when the squad's dying from 10 man. But if you lose the whole squad in a single turn, then I think things are a little bit better off for you. But still, it's a difficult way to play it, because it's not like another unit like Orcs where everybody has a power fist, so you can just roll 5 4-ups and then 5 guys get to pick and get to fight and you can choose them. In this situation, you're going to have to choose model by model. So you're going to have to choose model by model if you're doing the 4-up, fight on death. So sometimes you might want to essentially pick like a power fist to die if you really want it to fight on death. Just remember, when you're fighting on death, you're not going to get your +2 strength, your +1 attacks. So it is difficult to use this in the most effective manner, I feel like. Okay, Astra, we've covered. Lemartes is next, and he got a new pistol for whatever it's worth. So his pistol, he has a ballistic skill 2 in the pistol and is a 2 damage pistol. But he has been a very strong pick all edition, back before his pistol was like strength 4, 0 AP. He seems sort of as a solid all-rounder, because he's going to give you lethal hits all the time, right? And you don't have to be making charges for that. So anytime you fight, and you've got reroll hits because you're part of the Death Company. So anytime you roll a 6 on the hit, you make a lethal hit. And lethal hits actually perform pretty well because of the hit rerolls. So if you think you have more chance of rolling 6s because you're re-rolling some of the dice, right? And then he's got Guardian of Lost. While this model is leading a unit, each time attack is allocated, you subtract 1 from the damage characteristic of that attack. So against 2 damage and 3 damage weapons, he is very effective. Against 1 damage weapons, there's no difference, and against 4 damage weapons, there's very little difference, because even if you take -1 damage off a 4 damage weapon, you still need to roll like a bunch of 6s, right, to keep him alive with Feel No Pain. Astorath does not have grenades. Lemartes does have grenades. So it's a super minor, and there's a 5-point difference between the two, Astorath being 5 points more expensive, and they both can only attach to the Death Company Marines with a jump pack. So, like, in a simple comparison, this is what you've got. Astorath on the charge, dev wounds. Lemartes, all the time in melee attacks, lethal hits. On dying, Astorath's squad 4-up fight on death. On taking any damage, it's -1 damage, right? So Lemartes is seen as an all-rounder, and he also combats very nice with Red Rampage, right? If you can ever give his unit Lance, then that's very strong, because you go back to lethals in Lance. Astorath has currently been seen as the big YOLO, like you only live once, jump in, throw out a bunch of damage with the dev wounds. He also has dev wounds on his axe. For the purpose of this video, I've never actually included Astorath and Lemartes' damage output, right? So we're just looking at what they actually do to buff the Death Company. And basically you would throw your Death Company into a tough spot, try and do a bunch of dev wounds, and then when the enemies start killing your Death Company, you're going to fight on death 50% of the time. So that's the simple comparison. And I guess the point of doing this comparison, one is like, who's doing most damage, and also, is fighting on death 50% of the time better or worse than -1 damage all of the time, right? So there's a few factors here to look at. So how are you going to play Death Company in this situation where you're taking one of those two chaplains? I think what you want to be doing is you want to be taking the 10-man Death Company, which is 230 points. And you want to be arming them like I showed you on the previous slide, right? So we know that Death Company get to reroll all hits in melee. And because they're led by a chaplain, they are able to fall back, and they also have OC of 1, and you can reroll charges. So, but this isn't a durable squad, and please, please, please realize that this is not a durable squad, because I've had games where I've kept this squad on the table from the start of the game, and I've really regretted it. If I'm taking 10 plus Lemartes or Astorath, I'm probably definitely putting them into reserve. I'm then going to, in turn 2, ideally look for an opening. If I have to, we'll wait a little bit longer. But I'm going to look for a rapid ingress play, because I think this is the strongest play you can get from them, where you will basically bring the whole unit onto the battlefield, ideally in an obscuring position, and I've done other videos about this. You could probably watch some of my tournament matches to see how I do this, but I do it literally every game. You rapid ingress the squad 12 inches away from the enemy, in fact 12.1 inches away, so you can never be declared as a charge target. And then with your 12-inch move, you will jump forward to basically where you're only a couple inches away. You'll be able to shoot a bunch of pistols, you could throw a bunch of grenades, and then you would also charge your target. And with the reroll charges and the fact you've jumped forward 12 inches from being 12.1 away, the chances of you failing the charge are super slim. I would say that I very rarely ever fail with this Death Company to make a charge. So Astorath would be guaranteed his dev wounds, and this is how we'll probably see Death Company be played. More on how many Death Company to include on your list a little bit later, right? If you feel like you're going to get some value out of today's video, please like, subscribe, hit the bell if you want to be notified every time I go live. I'm not going to spend too much time asking you to do the algorithm things, but if you do, it's super appreciated. So let's talk about, like, if Lemartes is the leading unit, we're -1 damage. If Astorath's leading the unit, we've got no defensive bonus. So if we came up against 2 damage weapons, in this situation we use Orc Power Claws, which are Strength 9 AP2 weapon, right? Basically, the number of successful hits, this is successful hits, so it includes wound rolls, right? So the number of wound rolls that the Orcs would need to kill the 10-man Death Company with the -1 damage is actually 43, and without the -1 damage, it's 21. And I mean, the reason it would be 21 is, like, the Orcs wouldn't wound on 2s, so you would end up with something like 17 wounds. You would save on 5s, so you would end up with something like 11 failed saves, and then you've got your 6-up Feel No Pain, right? So against 2 damage weapons, and I did actually math out a couple of other 2 damage weapons to see how this changed, and it actually doesn't really change that much, right? in terms of like, it is all, Lemartes is 100% better against 2 damage weapons. So it doesn't matter what the AP is on these 2 damage weapons, he is just always going to be 100% better, right? And then against 3 damage weapons, and I use Knight Armigers, they are Strength 9 AP 1. And again, it doesn't really matter what the AP is, he is always going to be approximately 42% better against 3 damage weapons, because 3 damage with -1 damage becomes 2, and then I guess because you take those Feel No Pains in a single 6 out of the 2 dice essentially prevents one guy from dying, so there's actually a 42% increase in survivability against 3 damage weapons. So we know Lemartes has been very popular for the entirety of 10th edition, and this is why he has been very popular. I would say this is possibly more impactful than his lethal hits. He's just very good at keeping them alive. There's a lot of 2 damage weapons in the meta. I would say 3 damage is a lot less, but there's a lot of 2 damage. So when you come into enemies that throw out a ton of 2 damage weaponry, Lemartes has some really meaningful impact, right? Like, this is actually a nuts amount of power claws, you know, because even if an orc unit charges you with tons of power claws, I feel like 43, they need to have 43 wound rolls to destroy your unit. I feel like that is a lot of wound rolls, whereas I feel like maybe like 21 is doable. They can probably kill you out with 21. I guess here's the flip side. If they kill all 10 with 21, then half your guys fight back on death. So it's a weird one, right? Because in this situation, you're saying half the guys live. In this situation, you're saying half the guys fight on death. But realistically, you probably would be better off with half the guys live, right? Because they live to fight another turn, whereas the fight on death guys are done. They're dead. They're never fighting again. So I realize at the top of the slide it says shooting. That's completely irrelevant, because one of these weapons is close combat and one of these weapons is shooting. This is a template I used from another slide. Okay, so if we talk about their melee damage output, and what I did here was I picked like 5 things that Death Company typically like to kill, like Incubies, Terminators, 8-Bound, Talos, and Angron. Angron's meaningful because he's higher than toughness 10. And we took like Chainswords, the Power Fists, and Eviscerators, and just mathed that all out to get this column. So this is the damage output that you will do to like all these different units, and it's not necessarily going to be models killed, right? Because Incubi only have 1 wound. Some of these weapons do 2 damage, so 26 is not precisely the right number. And then against Terminators, like Terminators are 3 wound models, so some of this would be super inefficient. You would probably, against the Terminators, you'd probably want to do something janky where you attack with the Power Fists, then you attack with the Chainswords, then you attack with the Eviscerators. So you occasionally you're like killing a model with that extra 1 damage from the Chainswords. It's kind of janky. I guess you could. So this is the absolute base damage, but if wounds spill over to extra models, it's hard for me to calculate exactly how they would happen. But here's your base damage, right? So if you take Lemartes and you add in the lethals, you get a bonus of 5% additional damage, scaling up towards 50% against Angron. Obviously that makes sense, right? Lethals are more effective against higher toughness enemies because the lethals don't care about toughness. And then the same goes with dev wounds. You can see here, this is why people are essentially picking Astorath right now. He is doing more damage, right? We go from 5 to 50, we go from 13 to 66. Notably against Terminators, we have the big jump, and the reason for the big jump here is Terminators have a really good save, right? Of 4-up and vulnerable save, so devastating wounds, just cutting through that is actually kind of meaningful. So Astorath is very good against like units with good invuln saves, and also he's just going to do more damage against something like Angron because of the dev wounds, and even Chainswords, you know, you get 25 Chainsword attacks, so there's a lot of potential of devastating wounds there, right? Especially with all the rerolls to hit. So if we take charging and then add lance, and these are the numbers this is how the numbers increase when we add lance. So you can see adding lance, which was from the red rampage stratagem, will increase your damage output by like 15% up to 50%. So up to 50% better against those high toughness enemies. And I guess it really comes down to when you're fighting those high toughness enemies, that's when you really want lance. So if you're trying to work out when to use like red rampage to get the maximum value, if you know, like let's say you charge Sangreguard on one side of the map and you charge Death Company on the other side of the map, you probably want to be using your lance stratagem on the unit that you're fighting that has the highest toughness. Like if you want to maximize I mean, there could be a situation where you definitely want to kill the weaker unit or the lower toughness unit, so you want to use Lance there. But if you want to maximize damage output across the tabletop, then Lance is giving you the best bonus against highest toughness. And then if you add, again, Lemartes' lethals, we go from 5 to 25%, and if we add the dev wounds, we go from 13% to 44%. So dev wounds is both times coming in quite a bit higher than Lance. Dev wounds is coming in a lot higher against those really good invulnerable save units. And in general, it's, you know, the bonus against like 8-bound is double. So dev wounds is just statistically better for damage output than the lethal hits. And I guess if we actually break it down, Lemartes would only be getting, you know, like 6 attacks at AP2, and Astorath's bringing 7 attacks at AP3 and the dev as well. So once you factor in the character as well, I would say that you're getting even more benefit from Astorath. For those 5 extra points, you're definitely getting equivalent more 5 points of damage, right? So if you're just looking for raw damage output, Astorath is definitely the best option. And if you want to go one step further, and at this point, I guess it's important to know that like there's nothing else we could do to buff Lemartes at this point, right? He already has lethals and Lance, but we could take the red thirst negative, you know, when you get both lethal hits and Lance, to give Astorath dev wounds, Lance, and lethal hits. But what's interesting is if you do dev wounds, Lance, and lethal hits, you actually debuff your damage into those Terminators. So I guess it's good that we see units with a 4-up invuln, because lethals is actually going to hurt you a little bit in this situation. The lethals that you get here give a very small damage bonus to both like T7 and T11. So for the most part, I would say Astorath, you never want to take the negative part and fall to the red thirst, right? In the stratagem, Red Rampage, you can succumb to the red thirst and you can get lethal hits and Lance. In this, based on these numbers, most of the time you just want to always take lethal hits. The only time you'd ever really want to succumb to the Red Rampage, the Red Thirst, sorry, I'm getting Red Rampage, Red Thirst. The only time you ever want to take the negative is potentially against like a really high toughness demon, or, you know, like a very, very elite type unit, which is something like a Talus. And before we go any further, I just want to clarify that because there's a lot of potentials here. So select either lethal hits or Lance. So 99% of the time you always want to select Lance. The only time I suppose you don't want to select Lance is when you're not charging. So you can get lethal hits when you're not charging, but Lemartes already gives you that, and the lethal hits for the most part don't help all that much. But I guess if your Astorath unit was charged, there is the argument that you could spend 1 CP to get lethal hits on it, right? Because lethal hits don't require you for charging. But if you are charging and you want to buff their damage, always pick Lance, and you can instead choose to give into the Red Thirst, become battle shocked, and take both. But like I said, the extra bonus you get for taking both, for the most part, is very, very small, and I would probably only take it into like a giant demon like Angron, right? So then, I want to just take the old Death Company, right? The numbers for Death Company with all Power Fists and how they did before against this new Death Company, just so people have some sort of base of reference, right? Because lots of people have lots of games with the old Death Company and no games with the new Death Company. And what the numbers tell me is, against Terminators and Taloses, you're losing 45% of your damage output, and against 8-bound it's 40, and against Angron it's 37. So this is where the all Power Fist Death Company landed before, and this is where our new squad lands now. So a massive drop in damage output. I didn't include the Incubi because I think for the most part the old Death Company and the new Death Company completely wipe a squad of 10 Incubi, so I think it's kind of irrelevant in that situation. So if I try and sum up what we've seen so far, Lemartes' lethals is granting 5 to 50% damage more against higher toughness targets. Astorath's dev wounds is granting 13 to 66% damage, more again against higher toughness targets, but very effective against models with like a 4-up invuln like the Terminators. You're actually getting 30% bonus. Lance +1 to wound is doing 15 to 50% boost to damage output on the base value, which arguably means, like, if you did want to include like a cheaper regular chaplain with a jump pack, he's kind of right up there with Lemartes in terms of 15 to 50%. And he could actually still be useful or meaningful if you want to run units of 5s, because he is a bit cheaper at like 75 points. And he doesn't need to be charging to get that +1 to wound. He has it all the time. But again, the largest bonus comes against those high toughness targets. So yeah, like I said, if you're fighting multiple units on the battlefield, you might want to save your lance stratagem for another unit that's fighting something that's higher toughness. If you want the absolute maximum, you want to be using it against units that have the highest toughness. Lemartes is lethal hits plus lance. Lethal grants another 25 or 5 to 25 damage onto the lance bonus. So that's on top of this 15 to 50%. Again, it's mostly scaled towards the highest toughest enemies. And the dev plus lance is granting even more, 13 to 44%. Against the highest toughness enemies, again, it's preferable, and it's much better against those 4-up invuln save units. You're getting the maximum damage output here. So, and if you do use the lethals on Astorath, you actually lose something against the high invuln save units, but you do get a little bit of extra damage against those highest toughest targets. When we compare all the new Death Company against the old Death Company, our damage output is 37 to 45% less. Old Death Company were 280 points, New Death Company are 230 points, so the points drop is only down 18%. So if we think about this, basically Death Company have lost somewhere in the region of 20 to 25% damage, point for point. You know, it's important to note they've also lost their rerolls to hit in the shooting phase, and they've lost their 6 special pistols. You know, and before everyone could take an Infernal Pistol or a Plasma Pistol or even a Hand Flamer, that's gone. So we've lost 6 special pistols, we've lost rerolls to hit with the pistols. So if they stay at the current Codex points, right, like if Death Company are going to release at 230 points for 10, like they are in the Codex, they're going to be much harder to get the maximum out of, because your melee damage point for point is down like 20%, and your shooting damage is down considerably as well. For now, in my lists, I feel like I'm unlikely to run more than 10 Death Company. I'm still experimenting with Liberator Assault Group. In fact, just this Wednesday, I played a game against Imperial Knights, and that was a very interesting game. I'll link it at the end of the video if you want to check it out. But these guys are obviously much, much harder to get the most out of in terms of melee damage is 20% less point for point, and losing half their pistols. The pistol damage wasn't amazing, but it does change a few situations, right? And I'll come back to pistols in just a minute, right? So both Lemartes and Astorath, I think, are both very solid options to lead the Death Company. In terms of maximizing damage with no CP spend, and I always like to consider the fact that there can be times in the game where you've got no CP. So the Dev Wound charging Astorath squad are going to do more damage. In some situation, the damage between them and the lethals is minimal. It's actually less than 1 or 2 points of damage from the squad, but Astorath's axe is also a little better and offers dev wounds and precision. So Lemartes has been ignored as of late due to the buffs of Astorath, but in terms of him providing survivability bonus, it's still massive, it's still there. So if you're coming up against armies that have a lot of 2 damage output, Lemartes is still like possibly going to be the best choice. I wouldn't say the devastating wounds are far enough ahead to make you just twice as durable against those 2 damage weapons. So Astorath's Fight on Death will occasionally be useful, but I think it's much harder to utilize in the -1 damage buff, right? The -1 damage buff is just something that's always there, and I think it's always meaningful, right? Especially when you take a, you know, power claws suddenly become only 1 damage, and if you roll hot on a couple of saves, you can just suddenly not lose anyone at all, or hot on a couple of feel no pains. When you add Lance to both units, I think they're still very solid damaging unit, but Lance actually adds little to Lemartes, less than a 10% bonus to anything T6 or less. So if you're fighting with Lemartes against anything T6 or less, I feel like you should save your Red Rampage for another unit elsewhere. And it is good to know that, right? Because Red Rampage is arguably one of our best stratagems. I think the Sangre Guard are really going to need Red Rampage now that they have lost essentially like maybe like 20 attacks, I think, because there's 4 less models, right? Each model had 5. So you've lost 20 attacks. So you might be needing to give Red Rampage to the Sangre Guard more often. So it's really good to know that if you've got Lemartes and Lethals, if you're fighting a unit at T6 or less, that's fine. Just go with that. The bonus from Red Rampage is not meaningful enough to spend that there on the battlefield. But realistically, 10 Death Company have lost about 50% of their damage output, if you include the pistols that I said that we'd forgotten about earlier. So they lost, what was it, 37 to 45% of their melee damage, and then the 6 special pistols, so they've lost 50% of their damage. Their points have only dropped 20%, give or take. So and the chances of popping transports, right, or significantly weakening like a fright first enemy with your pistols is all but gone, right? Because before you could jump in and you could shoot 10 pistols with rerolls to hit, and you could do a bunch of damage, you could pop open a transport. I think that was possible with 10 Infernal Pistols. I think 2 Infernal Pistols, you're probably going to do like 2 or 4 damage, right? So I think the chances of like popping open transports or really weakening a big enemy unit is all but gone. So you can still use grenades, I guess, right? Death Company Marines do have grenades. Just remember, you cannot use them if advancing. So even if you use the advance and charge stratagem, you cannot use grenades. So maybe there's a situation now where you want to do some grenades to pop a few mortals off like a more durable unit before you charge in. But I think realistically, Death Company are just going to be much harder to play at new points values. We hope the Codex points are not finalized, but I guess we will see. I know that Death Company have been dominating the meta, and when something has been dominating the meta, Games Workshop usually don't... And they're not nice about the points reductions on things that are dominating the meta. Case in point are like those Desolation Marines were nerfed like 2 weeks after they came out, and they've been nerfed to the ground for like over a year at this point, right? So who knows? I think we are going to probably be playing them at 230 points per 10. But I guess this video lets you know exactly where you stand. So if they come in at 220 or 210, then you'll be able to quickly adjust this, right? So at the moment, the damage output is 50% down. The points drop is 20% down. No real change to survivability from where it was before. So so basically the ending answer then, before we get to the final slide and I say thanks so much for watching to the end of the video, is it's totally situational which one you choose, right? Like, Astorath will give you more damage output. Lemartes will make you really good against 2 and 3 damage weaponry. What do you prefer? Do you prefer fighting on death? Or do you prefer surviving against 2 or 3 damage weaponry? Because I feel like both units still do a good amount of damage. The chances of them popping big, like, big enemy units like Land Raiders or Demons in one turn is a lot less now. So potentially, if you are going to be trying to run multiple Death Companies, you're maybe going to need to be charging those big nasty units with multiple units of Death Company, or backing them up with some Sangre Guard or Jump Intercessors to push them over like the damage threshold. But I mean, the most interesting thing is, I think most people have played 10 Death Company, so most people have a feel of what 10 Death Company with Power Fists would kill, so now take their damage down 40%. That's roughly where you're going to land. I think my plan in the next few weeks is to use Astorath plus the 10 in Rapid Ingress a bunch of times and see if I get enough value out of Devastating Wounds on the charge to have that as like a core part of my army. I do like it that that's like, what, 335 points now. I mean, before when you took Lemartes on 10, you were 400 points, so it felt very difficult to run 2 10-man Death Companies, because that was like 800 points, whereas now I guess 2 10s, you know, you could have Lemartes leading 10, you could have Astorath leading 10, and you'd be in the region of like 665, which, I mean, if you just see what the difference there is, well, the difference is another 5 Assault Intercessors with jump packs, and another 5 Scouts, and I think that is meaningful. And 100%, you could actually run both these characters. They're both good when attached to Death Company. They both play a little bit different. But, yeah, I guess thanks for getting to the end of the video. I hope I enlightened you and gave you some useful information. Please feel free to ask any questions that you may have in the comments down below. If you know a Blood Angels player that this might be useful to, share the video. Subscribe if you're new to the channel, or click the big join button underneath or support us on Patreon, and there's a bunch of affiliate links in the video description. Thanks very much for supporting me on a weekly basis. I get so many more videos coming out, or plans to make so many more videos for the new Blood Angels Codex, and I am starting to prepare for my next GT. I know when it is now, so I will be building lists and iterating on lists to try and find my next GT winning Blood Angels list. As soon as we get some Blood Angels lists winning tournaments using the new Codex, and obviously using the MFM points when it's released, I'll make some videos on that as well, because it'll be really interesting to see what the community can come up with in terms of really strong Blood Angels lists. And I think that's always enlightening for everybody else. When someone finally wins an event with the new Codex, I'll share it, I'll make a video on it, I'll break it down as soon as I possibly can. It's been great to have your company for the last 25-30 minutes or so. My name is John, this is the Blood Angels Commander channel. I'll see you live Saturday night for a painting stream. We are painting Assault Intercessors at the moment. Have a great weekend, guys. Thanks ever so much for supporting the channel. By the blood are be made strong. Peace.